The library had always been a circle, but now it was spinning. Asha noticed it first in the mathematics wing, or what used to be the mathematics wing. The ivy that had claimed those shelves 3 years ago, the vines that had crept through the broken windows with the patience of continental drift, had suddenly shifted. Books that should have remained buried under creeping fig for another season had surfaced. The pattern had changed. She'd come to this city 6 months ago following a rumor that nature was reorganizing human knowledge in ways that made logical sense. Her previous work studying abandoned research facilities had left her with a gnawing question. What happened to half-finished ideas when the people studying them simply walked away? Did the knowledge die, or did it transform into something no one had anticipated? This library was supposed to be the answer to that question. 4 months of mapping had shown her only slow, predictable decay. Until today, she stood in the doorway, coffee cup cooling in her hand, the cup itself a salvage thing, stained with rings from a dozen other cities, and traced the geometry of it. The vines hadn't simply continued their slow march across the spines. They'd reorganized. Calculus texts clustered with physics journals, mathematics stacked against philosophy. Someone or something was sorting.
Welcome to Fable's Adventures. I'm your host, and today's narrative, The Verdant Archive, is a visual and psychological journey. It's a story about the intersection of nature and knowledge, and the moment an expert realizes they no longer recognize their own sanctuary. If you find beauty in abandoned places and the weight of forgotten history, this is for you. Please subscribe to enter the library. The coffee is getting cold. Let's go inside.
It was the kind of detail that would have passed most people by, absorbed into the general sense of organized decay that hung over the entire district like morning fog that never quite burned off. But Asha had spent the last 4 months mapping this place, tracing the loops and spirals of how nature reclaimed knowledge, and she knew the rhythm. She knew what speed looked like when it changed. 3 months ago, the vines had advanced perhaps 2 meters per week, predictable, observable, the kind of slow-motion catastrophe you could watch without feeling complicit in it. Now, standing here in the gray afternoon light that filtered through leaves grown so thick they'd become a second sky, she was looking at reorganization that had happened in days, maybe less. She set the coffee cup on a shelf. It would join the others eventually, adding its ring to the aureoles already staining the paper, and pulled out her notebook. The pages were worn at the edges from constant handling, corners folded back to mark observations she'd need to cross-reference. She'd filled half of it already with measurements, sketches of vine patterns, notations on which sections accelerated fastest in sunlight and which seemed to prefer the creeping shadows of the lower floors. The patterns weren't random. They'd never been random. That was the thing that had drawn her here in the first place, that invisible thread that always pulled her toward places that looked chaotic until you understood their logic. She began to write. Reorganization suggests directed growth, not random distribution. Correlation with... And stopped. With what? That was the problem. Every time she'd circled back to that question, she'd ended up at the same unmarked exit. The basement. The levels beneath the library proper, where she'd found sealed doors and equipment that hadn't been properly cataloged since the university's collapse. The basement, where half-finished experiments had been left to their own devices when the funding dried up and everyone simply left. Walked away from their work mid-thought, mid-sentence, mid-hypothesis. The building had become a monument to incompleteness. each abandoned project a sentence trailing off into silence. Asha had always been drawn to incomplete things. The process of learning fascinated her far more than the static fact of knowing. But this felt different. This felt like something was calling from underneath the library, demanding her attention. She took the stairs down. The basement smelled like rust and wet soil. The air was thick enough to taste. Her footsteps echoed in the darkness, making the space feel larger than it probably was. The laboratory was exactly where she'd found it before. A study in abandonment, papers scattered across desks, culture dishes in racks, a small greenhouse structure that had once held controlled conditions and now held only shadows and the smell of decomposing organic matter. But something had changed here. The greenhouse door was open, not broken, opened. The climate controls, which had been dark and dormant the last time she'd been down here, hummed with a faint electrical pulse. There was a plant in the center of the greenhouse, and it wasn't supposed to be there. Asha moved closer. The plant was tall, with broad leaves that shifted color in the dim light, but it was the growth rate that stopped her. She could see the markers on the bench beside it, measurements in neat scientific handwriting, dated months apart at first, then weeks, then days. The handwriting became shakier, the dates compressed. The final entry was from 2 weeks ago, barely legible. Day 287. Acceleration continues. Baseline growth now 8 cm a day. Recommend containment review. Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves. She'd found his name in the files upstairs, a botanist working on accelerated growth rates. He'd left notebooks, partial schematics, hypothesis after hypothesis, each one abandoned when the next question became more interesting than the answer. This was what he'd left behind. This, still growing. The plant's roots had cracked through the ceramic pot and spread across the bench in thick strands. The vine-like stems wound around the greenhouse frame, the light fixtures, the irrigation tubes, the electrical conduits. It was replicating, growing upward into the library proper. Asha pulled out her notebook and tried to write, but her hands were shaking. This was what had changed the pattern. This was what had reorganized the entire building. She climbed back to the upper floors and spent hours photographing the vines, cross-referencing their arrangement with the plant's growth measurements. By the time darkness fell, she understood. The vines weren't destroying the library. They were creating a map. The connections between disciplines had become visible. Mathematics linked to physics through biology, philosophy branching into chemistry. The books weren't being buried. They were being integrated. She sat on the library's front steps as fog rolled in from the city, and she faced the choice she'd been avoiding. She could go back down, cut the power to the greenhouse, watch the experiment die, contained and finished. The knowledge would be lost, but the chaos would stop. The circle would finally close. Except she remembered another city, another abandoned research facility, where she'd chosen containment over understanding. She'd sealed off a corridor to prevent the spread of an uncontrolled hydroponic system. 6 months later, she'd returned to find that other researchers had broken her seal, discovered her notes, and used them to develop a food production method that was now feeding 3 neighborhoods. She'd made her choice to protect what was there, and her choice had prevented something better from being born. That memory lived in her chest like a stone. She walked back down to the basement. Her hand hovered over the circuit breaker. One flip, darkness. The end of Dr. Reeves's work, finally and forever. Instead, she rerouted the electrical system, reduced the power to the greenhouse by half. The plant would continue to grow, would continue to push upward into the library, but slowly now, measurably, observed. She documented everything, the plant, The vines, the reorganized books, the hidden logic of it all. When she brought her photographs and notes to the university archives office, the remaining administrator looked at her work and smiled that tired smile of someone recognizing a pattern they'd been circling for years. "You're leaving," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "There's a city to the north. They say there's an old factory district with equipment no one knows how to use." "The archive," he said. "What do we do with it?" Asha thought about the plant still growing downstairs, still reorganizing the library around it. "You let it continue," she said. "Slowly, watched. Let people come study it, understand what the vines have created. Maybe someone will see patterns I missed. Maybe it will become something neither Dr. Reeves nor I could have anticipated." She stood to leave, and the fog swallowed the building behind her. But it wasn't erased. It was still there, still growing, still reorganizing itself in patterns that made sense if you knew how to read them. The experiment continuing, the knowledge surviving not by being preserved, but by being transformed into something that lived, something that moved, something that would never quite return to where it began, the way things were supposed to work, if you understood that completion and perfection were overrated, and that the most beautiful patterns were the ones with just enough space in them to let you slip through and emerge on the other side, changed.
Asha stood still, but her mind was racing through 1,000 catalog details. She realized that once nature takes root in an archive, the stories don't just sit on shelves anymore. They become part of the soil. The library wasn't dying. It was becoming something entirely new. If the cold gray-green and amber tones of this world stayed with you, please like and subscribe. For more atmospheric visual storytelling, check out the Fables Adventures app. Until next time.